with us today for the first time. In this episode, we're going to unpack delegation and dive into brain-based strategies to empower your team and free up your time for strategic thinking. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the comments or the chat where you are joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is also going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. And I know throughout the conversation, we'll be asking you some questions too. So to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. So an Aussie turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome to the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Thanks for being here today, David.
Thanks, Shelby. Thanks for all the work you do pulling all this together.
Thanks. And our moderator for today is the Director of Research at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as helps to communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she was a professor at Dominican College and New York University and a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the Director of Research at NLI, Dr. Emma Saro. Thanks for being here today, Emma, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Shelby. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, Emma, doing well. Happy Friday. Good to be back with you.
Happy Friday. Yeah, it's exciting to be here, especially because we're talking about something that we've been working pretty hard on. For anyone who doesn't know, and anyone who's been with us every week, you know what we're going to be talking about, leadership skills. And as we've been building this and throughout the months that we've been building this, we realize that there are some skills that leaders have a really hard time building. And we had a hard time building them. We know they're difficult for leaders for different reasons. And one of them we're going to talk about today. And also to get your early feedback and throughout, we hope this session is a bit more interactive. Think about the skills for you as a people manager, or as a leader, were the most difficult to develop as you were entering your role, or even now, the most difficult ones to still do and to build good habits around.
Yeah, we might ask you towards the end to share those towards the end, kind of some thoughts on what other topics you'd love to us to dig into.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, well, but for example, for delegation, we know that it's very difficult. Some early research has shown that, and there really isn't a lot about delegation in general in the industry world, in the industry research. But what we do know is that when organizations look at high delegation numbers, they find that it leads to increased growth, increased revenue, and there are reports of linking delegation done well with employee satisfaction in staff. So that's reason enough to make sure that we build it into the solution and to get it right. But I'll pass it over to David. Why do you think, in your mind, just generally, why delegation is so difficult?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like whenever I'm sort of out socially and I tell people what I do, they roll their eyes, and the first thing they say is like, "Oh my God, it's so hard to get people to do anything." And you know, this is, you know, my social circle, sort of entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and people up to all sorts of things, running smallish teams often, but like just this whole thing about sort of how do you get people to do what you want them to do? That's essentially, you know, what delegation is. And you see people kind of falling into all sorts of traps, but it brings up a lot of different emotions for people. Like some folks are like really uncomfortable asking for help, right? Some people just like really feel anxious, you know, when they ask another person for help, and they kind of you know, just don't ask for help anywhere near enough. And when they do, they're not clear about it because they feel awkward about it, right? Some people are almost at the other end of that continuum. They like think everyone should be helping them all the time, and they actually don't get specific enough about the kind of help they need and what they need, and they just sort of assume people will work it out because they deserve the help, and then they just get mad when they get it wrong, right? So there's all these different sort of emotions in it. And I think one of the things I see the most is there's one of the biases, it's called the false consensus effect, which is it's a type of experience bias. So we framed up the 5 categories of bias in the seeds model. And the second E is experience bias. Essentially, it's the way we see the world through a set of filters, and we assume that that's the way the world is. Like a lawyer sees a lot of risk and assumes everyone else lives in that world. No, the marketing person next to them lives in a world of opportunity, and they assume that's how they see the world, right? But anyway, there's this false consensus effect where you understand something and it's really hard to imagine someone else not understanding it. And so, false consensus, right? And so, you'll have in your mind exactly how to do a task, right? And it'll just seem so obvious to you that everyone else, should understand it. And you'll give sort of basic information, but you won't realize that there are all these steps at which people could make really different choices. And you just kind of, so, sometimes what happens is people like, they'll try to delegate. They'll just see these people not doing what they want, and they'll just kind of give up and all this. But anyway, there's all sorts of sort of psychological reasons. But we found, as we were really digging into this, that there are sort of 3 broad traps that people fall into, and they kind of follow along with this with the sort of different, these different scenarios. But let's talk about those.
And I guess I should say they're all natural tendencies. So our biases are natural tendencies. Some of the traps stem from just our need to fill our own sense of certainty, our own sense of autonomy. And so and also maybe in response to being set up with a whole new set of responsibilities. So this is, maybe more difficult as a new leader to figure out how to delegate well. In the face of all their cognitive capacity being maxed out with all of these new tasks. So there are a number of different reasons why we tend to fall into them. And it's good to kind of see what happens. The end result is what happens to your team when you do.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about these one at a time. So the first trap is just like, you might try delegating a bit. You see people don't do it the way you would do it. And so you're just like, oh, to heck with it. I'm going to just do it myself, right? And you end up just doing a lot yourself. And you kind of annoy your people because they're like, well, they should be doing that, right? And you get the manager who's sort of doing the employee's work and sort of exhausting themselves, and then complaining that the employees sort of not doing things. And I think that partly it's if you know a task really well, right? If you're if you code for a living and you've been coding a certain software, you're going to be faster at it, right, than the person you hire for the first days or weeks or months, right? And so there's going to be this tendency of, oh my God, these people are too slow, I'm just going to do it myself, right? You feel more certainty, more autonomy in that, and it's like it makes you anxious, watching the speed. So you've got to sort of fight against that tendency, and I guess there's a bias in there. It's an expedience bias, right? You're just trying to do the fastest thing. But any comments on this one? Sort of, I'll do it myself, Emma.
Yeah, no, I think this is especially, and we've talked about this is especially like prevalent in new leaders. For one, they're stepping into this role or people manager, and they have all of these skills they're bringing with them. And now they have to make sure that these skills are done by their team as opposed to them, because they have a whole new set of responsibilities.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's hard to give up on those things that got you to that position, especially because you did them well. As you said, if you were a coder, you did those things well, but you really do have to help your team grow. And I think that the pausing to remind yourself that the team needs to grow is part of the challenge, and that might bring in that bias mitigation.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And so what happens is everyone processes everything really differently, right? So you get like, the way you code, some software, like there's literally infinite different ways you can kind of do it when you really drill down to the details. And what happens is you'll be used to doing a task, and someone else will come along, and it's not just that they might be slower than you, it's that they're following a whole different path than you for like coding or for like organizing an event, right? Or like, you do it using this software, they're like using their phone. Like you're like, how you need to do this. So everyone has these really, really different maps, and it's just the way the brain is created, is that like even the neurons you use today to hold a phone are like different to the neurons you'll use in 2 weeks to hold that same phone. Like it's very, very dynamic in there. And what happens is everyone's very, very, very different in the way they approach everything, even like identical twins. So you'll get the exact same task that looks like to you, to your brain, it's really obvious that you should just do it this way, right? It's really obvious you should, use this software in your computer. It's much more efficient. Someone else's brain just sees the world differently. And for them, it's like, no, they want to do it on their phone. They want to do it using screen grabs and all sorts of completely different ways. And the problem is, like, if you just tell someone they're wrong, right? And it's like, well, they actually might be efficient for their brain, right? So you struggle with this thing of like, maybe sometimes people might be doing it 20% less effectively than you would. But if you tell them, no, you have to do it my way, now they're going to do it like a lot less effectively than you would.
Right.
So sometimes you sort of got to accept that people doing things differently, but doing them well, is actually okay. And it's sort of a struggle. Have you noticed this as you're kind of managing people in there?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to pause and realize that, yeah, seeing somebody do something different will set off a little bit of an error signal. You think, oh, you can see all of the ways they could maybe take a left turn and go someplace different with it, but they might end up at the same end result. And they're also learning along the way and building their own mental maps to get there. Yeah. And part of your job as a manager is to help that team grow as well. And growing also requires mistakes and, figuring new things out, figuring new pathways out. So that growth mindset piece, I think, also comes into play. It's hard for managers. And I also think that there's the pressure that a new manager or leader has to reach their own goals might mean their team needs to move a bit faster. And so they're kind of balancing that pressure to get there with the pressure to the need to grow their team.
There's some great comments in the chat from folks. Thanks for contributing. Any other thoughts you want to put in the chat about kind of why people might kind of just give up and do it themselves as a manager, or kind of what's driving that? Just throw any other comments. Some really interesting comments there. But fundamentally, you sort of need to have this growth mindset of wanting people to learn, knowing that it's okay to make mistakes and all of this. But people have, there's some people you might think of as very controlling. They want everything their way, and they really struggle as a manager. Until they sort of let go of some of that. It might be an amazing individual contributor, but if you're a super control freak, so to speak, and everything has to be done your way, you sometimes will really struggle as a manager. Some really good comments. Perfectionist. Someone who's a perfectionist can really struggle with this one. And want to do it themselves. Let's go to the sort of opposite end of the spectrum, or different end of the spectrum, not opposite. But the second trap is basically like micromanaging. Why do you think people do this, Emma? What do you think is driving the micromanaging?
Yeah, so this one I think is a pretty clear, you're trying to set yourself up to have enough scarf buffers we talk about. Like you want to give yourself a lot of certainty, a lot of autonomy, and that's driving you to make sure you know exactly what's going on, to have total control of every single step along the way. But as we know, like the opposite happens for your team. Like they're losing certainty, they're losing all of the autonomy, and they're probably also losing a sense of status and relatedness, which sets up a huge amount of this like scarf threat in that situation. And then also set them up to not trust you and with your lack of confidence in them.
Right. So I'm just imagining like you're running a customer event, right? You're trying to gather, 20 people in a room somewhere to do a presentation, and you're the manager, but you have an event person running this. The micromanager is like, wanting to be copied on every email and wanting to be updated every few hours. And is constantly telling people, no, you've got to do it this way. So they're not doing the work themselves, right? They're expecting the other person to do the work, but they're constantly kind of telling them, how to do things differently. And it's really going to affect a person's status. They're going to feel like they're not able to make choices, and hugely their sense of autonomy or feeling of control. They're not in control of anything, right? And very frustrating. But it's really common. And I think there's a lot of fear driving this. Fear of other people messing things up, but it's maybe not as much fear as I'll do it myself. Sort of I'll do it myself is the highest fear, and this one is like a little bit less fear, but it has these really negative consequences. Throw some comments in the chat, folks. Why do you think people will micromanage? What do you think is driving this? Let's get some comments in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it definitely will lead to an erosion of trust. I saw trust in the chat as well, and I think, you know, signaling that you don't have any confidence in them, and think about what that does for the growth of. I mean, all of these generally impede the growth of the employee because you're kind of hindering their ability to make their own way to get to the solution. And you can also imagine how exhausting it is for the manager to
Yeah.
do this. You have to have sight on every single thing that happens. It's exhausting.
Yeah, someone Sue summarized this in 3 letters: ego. You know, just someone who's got a really, really strong ego, maybe. There's some interesting comments, you know, someone who's just wanting to show their value, right? To prove they're doing something. So, and yeah, interesting comments on kind of why people might micromanage. It's like an itch that has to be scratched. Yeah, Mike, it's Nidhi's comment. Micromanagement isn't always bad. If you've got a brand new employee doing something really important and they don't know how to do it yet, you might want to like be constantly checking in with them.
Mhm.
But micromanaging someone, you know, 6 months into their role where they've, you know, clearly proved themselves is a different thing. And I think
Yeah.
it has some, there are definitely some times where you want to manage closely, and that's
Right.
adaptive. I think what we're talking about here is where, you know, you really should be kind of doing something different.
Yeah. Interesting because it seems that at some point you do have to, once you know you can trust the employee to, you know, reach their goals or whatever it is, then you should back away. And I had an old my research advisor, he had like a very specific way of working with new team members. He had the mindset that I will trust you to do whatever you need to do until you break that trust, which is kind of the opposite of this. And then once you're not able to reach that goal, then I'll step in and start to
Right.
kind of like
Interesting.
micromanage a bit until you get there. But it's kind of a different mindset. With this, micromanaging seems like it comes first. Like I will micromanage you until maybe forever, or until I know that you can get these things done, and then step back.
Yeah, some really rich comments from everyone. Thanks. And thanks, Mark, for the study. So people are spending 40% of the time still doing work from their previous role because they didn't think anyone could do it as well as they could. We're going to come back to that one. That's such an interesting point. Let's get to the third trap. So the first one is I'll do it myself. The second one is I'll micromanage. The third one is managing by abdication. It's sort of like
Right. Yeah.
this is like not caring. You know, you're sort of maximizing the team's autonomy in a way. You're giving people control, but you're doing that in a way that doesn't create certainty, so that they don't really know what's expected of them, what great looks like. There's no clear guidelines or kind of modeling of what's supposed to happen, and so the manager's just like, yeah, go and do it.
Yeah.
What do you think's driving that? You know, what's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah. I think maybe one is that, you know, not wanting to have that interaction, you know, not wanting to maybe like have the interaction of having to tell somebody what to do. And also maybe a bit of, I don't want to be, maybe not admitting it, but I don't want to be blamed when this goes south, you know, stepping totally
Right.
out of the fire essentially and letting things just happen. I'm going to give my team total autonomy to do what they want, but I also don't have to be involved. And it's the opposite.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So you sort of like abdicating responsibility. So things go wrong, you can say, well,
Wasn't
you
it?
just have no blame. I have to go back to micromanaging for a minute. Comment from Liz is just priceless. Even my dog hates to be micromanaged. I've given him autonomy to choose his walks, but if I step back in and choose that walk, I run the risk of him doing sit down strikes. That's hilarious. Thanks, Liz. So yeah, people, mammals maybe don't like being micromanaged. Not just humans. So yeah, managing by abdication. Yeah, comment from Hillary. It's particularly frustrating during performance appraisal time because you're never really clear what was expected of you, right? And so you've got real issues with certainty, but also real issues with fairness as the year goes on. So you've got high autonomy, but low certainty, low relatedness, low fairness. So as you look at the 5 scarf domains, you can see how these kind of play out in really different ways. Yeah, that's super
Yeah.
interesting. So the 3, you got I'll do it myself, which is kind of really anxious. You've got micromanaging, still anxious, but letting people try. Then you've got going the other way, which is just like not giving people any information really at all, and just
Yeah.
kind of hoping that they'll do it. Did
Yeah.
we miss anyone, folks? Do you think we missed any
Yeah.
categories of sort of what the traps there?
Yeah. And also, if you were to think about, which one would you tend to fall into if you had to fall into a trap? or which one, hit you first when you were, a new manager?
Yeah,
Right.
that's a good question.
Yeah.
What's your trap sometimes? Obviously not all the time, but sometimes we fall into a trap when we're, overwhelmed. Um,
We're not all perfect.
yeah, but what's your most likely trap that you fall into? Trying to think what's mine. What's mine, Emma? What do you think? What do you think mine is? Probably doing
I'm
it
not sure.
myself.
I don't know if I want to share.
It's probably doing it myself. I
Mhm.
get anxious. I'll just try and step in and do it myself. There's a few do it myself. There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say doing it myself, that's a hard one, especially someone new in the role. Because I think someone else said earlier that sometimes you really enjoy doing those tasks too. So
Right.
sometimes you give up those tasks because that's what got you there.
Right. There's a
Yeah.
lot of doing it myself, isn't there? We should have done a poll for this. A lot of do it myself in there. And to someone's comment earlier, it's true that you might really have gone into the career you're in because you love doing the work, right? If you're a writer, you love writing, and now you're managing writers and you're not getting to write as much. You're like, where's my joy? Where's my writing? So it's really quick to kind of go back to doing the work. And I think a lot of managers really struggle to give up doing the work.
Yeah.
Although some roles require it, but I
Yeah.
think they probably, err on the side of too much just because it creates more status, more certainty, and more autonomy when you're doing the work.
Yeah.
It's kind of good for your status. The other thing is when other people are doing work, you're raising their status, but it's not doing much for yours, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the sort of common one in this group anyway is doing it yourself. As Harry said, not delegating enough and just trying to do too much, which means doing it yourself.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's change gears. Thanks for all the interaction, everyone.
Yeah.
Super makes it super interesting. So what are the things? What are the steps? And we've been thinking about this for a long time, and we've been inputting this into our new lead solution. There's a couple of things I think are really important. The first thing is like this is a really important question, and someone alluded to this before. It's not just what happens if you do someone else's work. It's what happens to them. It's what work do you not get to, right? What do you not do if you're doing work that you shouldn't be doing, right? If you're, running that event and you should actually be, like building relationships with people. Now you're not building relationships with people. You're like working the door, right? So what do you not do, I think? And so this begs a question. One of the first things I think to think about to delegate well is to ask yourself the question, what is the thing that only I can do that really no one else can do? Like what's the thing that only I can do or only I should do? It's a really, really important question. And there's an interesting, we didn't talk about this much, but there's a really interesting scientist. He's passed away a few years ago now. Elliot Jacques is his name. He's kind of controversial for a bunch of reasons. He's in some ways his work is a precursor to our work in that he studied the biological foundations of management in particular. And he's got a few controversial ideas, but one of his ideas I think that's really powerful is around this basically how long you focus on a task is kind of defines the levels of management. So if you're basically a frontline person, say managing an event, you think about the events that day and that week. You don't really plan much more, right? So that's your focus. If you manage, 5 people running events, you're thinking about the week and the month, maybe the quarter.
Yeah.
Right. But if you're managing a team of those people, you're thinking about the quarter and the year.
Mhm.
If you're managing those people, you might be thinking about 5 years if you're the CEO. So it's sort of like how far out are you thinking? And the leader of an organization should be thinking like many years out. And no one else does do that thinking, right? Whereas the frontline employee needs to be thinking about today. If you have a frontline employee thinking about, long-term processes, you've got a problem. I had my very first job was working in a kitchen when I was 18 years old, and my brain was always very busy, and I was working in the kitchen and then spending time thinking about how to make the whole restaurant run better. And they fired me 4 days in. They just wanted someone to think to wash the dishes and shuck the oysters, right? I'm like, yeah, but I can make this whole thing better. Like, that's not your job. So my job was to focus on, this daily stuff. And so coming back to my point, as a manager, what is it only you can do? Like maybe your team can't focus on quarterly and annual planning and like getting the right staffing in place and motivating everyone. And you have to do that stuff. So what's the stuff you have to do is a really important question. I think that's the first thing to think about sort of when you when you're thinking about delegating? What is it only I can do, or should do? Any comments on that, Emma?
That's a great point. I mean, it's kind of like the level of construal that you're thinking on, right? Like you really do have to, and maybe the way to kind of mitigate this is set up your day so that you focus on those things before you dive into any of those other tasks that you kind of want to do, that you'd rather do. Is set up your day so that you set aside 2 to 3 hours a day where you're focusing on that vision thinking, that strategic thinking, for your team, or the level that you need to be on, so that you complete it. Because otherwise, then you're failing on both sides, right?
Yeah.
You're not getting those goals, your team goals, completed, and you're not helping your team grow at the same time.
Yeah, we have this really fun framework that we teach in leadership programs, and it's in Lead. And it's called Choose Your Focus. I'll put it in the chat. It's essentially the 5 ways that your brain can focus on any task. And we kind of made it a little bit humorous, but there are these 5 ways that your brain can focus, and they actually relate to really different brain processes and have really different outcomes. Vision thinking is basically like big picture thinking about why you're doing something. So if you're running this event, like, why are you running it? What's the purpose? What do you want people to get out of it? Is it about motivating people? Is it about inspiring people? Is it about selling something? Like, what's the vision? This event, yeah, thanks. We call it Choose Your Focus, and this activates very, very different circuitry to all the others. Vision thinking, it's very visual. The occipital lobe is activating. It's very motivating. You're getting these positive rewards from thinking about this stuff. But it's quite abstract and tangible as well. So it's just kind of big picture why you're doing something. Now, when that kind of thinking, I'm going to say this, when that kind of thinking is robust, excuse me, when that kind of thinking is robust, the planning that you do is much, much, much easier to do. Like, if you know your reason for doing it is just to inspire people, then your plan is really clear. The other thing that happens, and this has been studied, in particular, Batya Weisenfeld at NYU studies this stuff really deeply. When the vision is really clear, when you hit an obstacle, the plan becomes really flexible. Like, if you have a vision of inspiring people, then you have this plan of, everyone arriving at 7 and chatting, and then you realize no one can get there till 8. You're like, your hair doesn't go on fire. You're like, oh, let's come up with a different way of inspiring people, because the goal is inspiring people. But if you start just with a plan, you were running an event, the plan is X, the plan is they arrive at 7, but you have no clear vision why you're doing it. Like, you're a mess, right? So really clear vision enables the planning, and the planning is a whole different brain network. It's the premotor cortex, where you're literally picturing an outcome and working out the steps to get there and chunking out things. So planning, chunking. And then the detail is actually doing the work. And then the problem is when the work goes wrong, and the drama is when everyone starts, arguing. But so what happens is the manager needs to be putting in that vision thinking, right? Why are we doing this? And a little bit of that planning thinking, and then kind of leave a lot of the details to the people, right? To the team. So you want to be, and that's something only the manager can do. You can't have an employee setting vision and setting plans so much. They can do a bit of planning. But you want to do vision thinking, planning thinking, let the team, work on the details, and then you have less problems and a lot less drama.
And I think we talk about this a lot, but the role of reminding everyone of the goal, and that's another role of the leader, is reminding everyone when they get into that detail phase and they start getting frustrated when things go wrong, is, let's remember, this is the goal. This is where we have to be. And that kind of like eases up flexibility, that cognitive flexibility.
Yeah, some great comments in the chat there. So what is it only you can do? That's a question as a manager, and we've been talking about kind of one of the things only you can do, which is really creating clarity about why you're doing what you're doing and what the intention is, and clarity about the plan. So those 2 levels, that's something the manager can only do. And then the clearer that is, the easier it is for people to then execute, these other things. So that's one big thing. What can only I do? There's the second thing I think is really interesting, and when we built the skill, when we kind of refined the skill into Lead, we call it delegate and let go. The skill is delegate and let go, and I think this is a really, really important skill. Like, delegate well, and we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what that looks like. But it's delegate well and then actually let go, and the letting go part is really important, because you don't want to do it yourself. You don't want to micromanage, right? You want to keep a certain, good amount of oversight. But you've got to kind of delegate well and then really, really let go. And that's hard, because your certainty drops, right? Your sense of certainty drops. If you're not getting constant reports, you're like, are they messing up, right? Your sense of autonomy drops, the feeling of control. oh my gosh, I'm not in control. I'm letting people. So, and it's interesting when the pandemic hit, there was a bifurcation in culture. We saw this massive bump in the sale of keystroke software in corporations. And it became something like 25% of companies now had keystroke software, where you're basically tracking who's like using their computer and literally how long they are every day and what they're doing and all this stuff. But it resulted in this equally giant jump in the sale of mouse jigglers, which are essentially is a device that moves your mouse for you while you're at the beach. And every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But the point is, there was this massive bump in companies kind of freaking out about, monitoring people, essentially not letting go. And it had a lot of adverse effects out there. There's a lot written about it. And the surveillance mindset was really difficult. So you got to fight with this desire that comes from real concern. It comes from real concern of not knowing what's happening and not feeling in control. You got to kind of battle against that and really sort of be willing to let go and then coach more. Right, you're used to like being in the game with the person or on the side of the game. Now you're seeing a replay once a week, by phone. You gotta. It's painful as you sort of let go. You gotta like process that pain and kind of get past it. But it's a really important point, Emma.
It really is, yeah. And some of these comments are speaking to this too. Is how do you find control in that? Because the reason that the mouse jigglers were all of a sudden like shooting through the roof is because the employees were trying to regain some control over this as well. So both parties needed control because that autonomy is a huge driver for us, having some control. And so, you kind of understood both sides of this, but how do you then, when you're trying to let go, how do you find that bit of control? It's like you have to build in processes to have pieces of control by not overstepping.
Yeah, and it's a kind of autonomy battle, isn't it? The company's trying to regain control, the employees just fighting back. And it's the results are sort of a lot of wasted effort. So let's talk to the sort of center of this. What do you do? And I see some questions coming up. We think there's two things. You want to actually maximize certainty and autonomy in a certain way. So you want to have the highest possible certainty without micromanaging, and the highest possible autonomy without just abdicating, right? So that's the way to think about it. So the highest possible certainty is not is really about creating clarity, because you can't really create certainty. You can't map out everything that's going to happen along the way. But what you can do to maximize the certainty axis is show people examples of what great looks like, right? If you're managing a team of people running events, like show them how other people have run events, but don't show them one way. Yeah. Show them 5 different ways that really good people have run really successful events and all the different ways that they've done it. So you're showing people what great looks like, but not anchoring on, oh, you've got to do it exactly like this. Like these are all examples of what great looks like. And then people can go, oh, okay, well, I can see that I can get a sense of what the quality needs to be. Like that's what's common in all of these is really managing well and whatever, but I can also find my own way. So you got to maximize clarity. That means like what your expectations are. Lots and lots and lots about your expectations, about what the guidelines are. Here are the guardrails. You can't go outside this, right? So expectations, what great looks like, guardrails, lots and lots of that. What that does, it doesn't really create certainty, but it creates clarity, which is so that's kind of half of it. And then the other half of it is maximizing autonomy. So you want to give people the feeling of real control by being clear, there's clarity again, about what they have control over, right? So if you're like, again, back to running an event, you're running an event, you've got someone you're managing, it's like, hey, you're in charge of the bar, you do that however you want, as long as we collect money and as long as no one drinks more than X drinks, right? Like whatever it is, you set it up, right? Whatever you're comfortable with. And I think the more clear you are with that, the better. Right. The more you're like, hey, you're in charge of this within these guide rails, right? So you're maximizing both clarity, which is a proxy for certainty. You're maximizing clarity and you're maximizing autonomy.
Yeah.
And I think that's the right way to do it. What do you think, Emma? What's your perspectives?
Yeah, all of this makes a lot of sense. And I think where you're kind of getting at is like that, like you're creating like an expectation, this like mental map of exactly what is the goalpost, where are the barriers. It really sets like even just creating that expectation reduces just like the general uncertainty threat.
Yeah.
And the clarity is there to make sure that both sides understand the same thing. One of the things that I find is been like so important about like managing things like events or things like that is just making sure that the roles are so understood. Like this is what this person, you own this role. And that also helps to provide a sense of status for an individual too. So this is what I own. This is what I'm responsible for. There's no uncertainty around like who owns what. And when should I step in and when should I not? So I think all of those and making sure everyone understands the same thing and there's all this like set expectations that you're more likely, and then where can you make decisions, like who's like what best do I follow? I can choose like these people did all of these things differently, but I choose the thing that they did best and
Right.
allow the way there. I think all of that.
Yeah, yeah. So lots of communication about expectations, about what great looks like, but then as much autonomy as you're comfortable or as as you can give people. You're really trying to work hard to like let people have things that they're fully in control of. And really, really helpful. So yeah, so let's change gears a little bit. A couple people asked about accountability, and I think that's sort of the final piece of this is to delegate with accountability. So what can I only do? Work that out and then let go, right? But do it with clarity and autonomy. But then finally, the piece is about accountability. It's a really big word. It's a complicated word. We've been thinking about this a lot, and because we've been building this into Lead, and it's such an interesting idea. There's actually a set of skills that really you need to build to create accountability. But I want to go back to Elliot Jacques. And so one of the other kind of things that surprised me in his research was this statement that it's the manager's job that the employees do their tasks properly. Like the manager's accountable for the employee to do their task properly. Now you say, well, that sounds obvious, but what he literally means is if someone messes up on a task, the manager gets fired, not the employee. Right? That the manager is completely accountable for the employee actually doing things right. And that's kind of a different idea, right? In most management structures, it's like, well, if someone doesn't do something right, you fire them or you give them feedback or something. But there's something the manager hasn't done right, if that's the case. And it's interesting. So we've been looking at the habits for accountability. And what are the cognitive habits to the people who are good at this really have? Do you want to talk through those a little bit, Emma?
Yeah. And really it's, changing the way we look at accountability, because I think in general, once you hear the word accountability, you start thinking, oh, I'm going to be punished for something. Like, did I not get that thing right? And I think, and when we talk about delegation, I think if you're doing that well, you're also able to foster accountability. I think both of these things are kind of one comes with the other. And we think about delegation and like accountability, creating accountability for you as a leader, and also with your team, getting them to feel like a growth-oriented form of accountability starts with thinking ahead and like creating those mental maps of like where to go. And that speaks to that, setting those expectations. And then making sure that you obsess about your commitment. So thinking about that expectation and making sure that you're following through with your team, and then your team will do the same, knowing that when you don't, that creates an error signal for people. And then finally having this idea that solutions come before reason, or solutions over reasons, like having that growth mindset. I'm gonna figure out the solution and jumping in to figure out the solution when I make a mistake.
Let's dig into these one at a time. And as people are noticing some kind of challenges with Jacques' theories, I will say he's one of the most controversial management thinkers around. I'll put a link into a good summary of his work. Like a lot of people really disagree fervently with his frameworks, and his work hasn't really taken off except in a sort of some pockets. So I'm not saying that it's all his ideas are great ones. They're actually provocative ideas, and sometimes they'll provoke you to think differently. But one of the more provocative and sort of interesting thinkers out there I think, in this way. But let's dig into these habits a little bit more. The first one's think ahead. So this is an interesting one. Like accountability. So as a manager, right, you're being accountable for people doing things right, right?
Mhm.
So and let's go back to, you're running an event for customers. You got a team of people, you want it to go right. You got to think ahead. Now, what does it mean to think ahead? You want to think ahead about like all the things that can go wrong, right? All the ways things can kind of unexpected things can happen. But even like, oh, this is a new team member, right? They don't know a lot. So I've got
Right.
to, they're going to be uncomfortable. They're probably not going to ask for help. So I've got to be extra thoughtful. There's a mechanism called mentalizing. And mentalizing is essentially holding something in mind and kind of making these
Plans.
connections. It's called
Yeah.
spreading activation. So let's say your whole in mind, going to Sydney, right? You've decided you like my accent, you want to hear more Australian accents. So you're going to Sydney, right? It's currently winter where you are, and you're going to fly to Sydney. Like you'll pack terribly if you don't actually spend some time picturing being in summer, right?
Yeah.
Like you got to picture, you got to mentalize walking around the streets and it's hot. And then you go, oh, water bottle. I should bring a water bottle. Oh, I should bring a hat. If you're going to Australia, definitely bring a hat. It's slip, slop, slap over there. So if oh, I can buy sunscreen. I don't need that. I probably should bring a hat. So you've got to really picture this, and that takes effort. It takes stopping, thinking about what you're doing, and actually picturing what what you've got to do. And a busy manager who's done this 1,000 times, 1,000 employees, just is going to be lazy and is just like not going to mentalize well. And then they don't, they just haven't noticed that this person's English isn't perfect and that they're going to be uncomfortable talking to people, and they maybe shouldn't be on the door welcoming people the first time, right? So it's thinking ahead is really holding in mind the whole situation. It's quite a generous act, holding in mind the whole situation, and mentalizing all the steps that are going to happen. It is kind of episodic, as Chatili is saying. It's visual, activating the planning network. And to Sandra's point, it's perspective taking, but it's taking other people's perspective. Perspective taking is really hard to actually perspective take. There's a study showing that when you're taught to take perspective and try to have more empathy, people become more confident that they understand others, but not actually more accurate, unless they ask really good questions. So you've got to really ask lots of questions to really think ahead, right? Not just imagine it in your own head. But how this relates to accountability is if you're giving people the task, right? You're managing someone who's running an event. You used to run the events, right? You're managing someone run the event. To think ahead, you've got to imagine all the ways this particular person at this particular point in their career, this particular team, imagine all the ways this could go right and wrong, and think ahead and make sure that you're thinking about all contingencies, right? You're thinking about, you're thinking about everything that could happen. Hey, if everyone doesn't arrive till 8 o'clock, what are you going to do? And again, with micromanaging,
Yeah, and I think a part of think ahead is also communicating that as well. So making sure that everyone has the same expectation. I mean, like the mental imagery is like such a powerful way to plan for the future. There's all of these amazing studies, but then if you share that image that you have, this is what I imagine to happen. These are the different things that I imagine to happen, and that we could do in that place, then someone else has the same expectation. And you know exactly what's expected. Yeah.
So thinking ahead it's a generous act. It's about paying attention in the present, to really what's happening, what people are doing. It's about perspective taking of the other person, which requires asking questions as well. It's about imagining the whole episode and the whole experience, and it takes a lot of cognitive load. It's a very generous act. It takes a lot of effort to do it, but it's a piece of accountability. What happens if you don't do that is you just make a ton of assumptions, right? You're assuming everything's going to start at 7 o'clock. You're assuming everyone's going to turn up. You're not really planning for what happens if they're late. And then you don't realize that the new person you hired is falling apart at 7:45, and has just left because they're feeling like they've failed. So that's the first element of accountability, is thinking ahead. There's a very brain basis to this. It's like picturing, holding mind. It's called spreading activation, like taking a concept and you're making connections between that concept and other concepts. That's what you're trying to do. The second one is obsessing about commitments, and this is basically keeping your promises. This is about if you say something is going to happen, then it's going to happen. And we all need a lot more people in our lives like this, that they say one thing and that happens, or they clean it up if not.
Mhm.
Right? If they say they're walking out the door in 5 minutes, they're walking out the door in 5 minutes, not in 8 minutes, or 20 minutes. So we all could do with more of that, particularly in the teams that we work in. Yeah, integrity is a way of thinking about that. There's other ways to kind of define it, but it's your words and actions being completely synonymous. And we call it obsess about commitments. You could say obsess about your statements, obsess about your promises, keep your promises. There's different ways to phrase it, but accountability is, as the person kind of giving tasks, it's obsessing about the promises, but as a person receiving tasks, it's also like, okay, I'm promising to, be there at 7 o'clock, ready to go. I have to actually be there at 7 o'clock, ready to go. Oh, sometimes there's traffic. Okay, maybe I should be there early, plan to be there early. So I am actually there, right? So, so obsessing about commitments is kind of going the extra mile. And there's a little bit of the first element here, the first skill of planning ahead, but it's really, really caring that the expectations you create are actually met. Because when there's a gap between an expectation and what happens, people get a strong threat response. That only needs to happen a couple of times, and you lose trust in someone, you lose faith in someone.
Yeah. And you think about how often you're resetting that expectation of this person. So it clearly relates to delegation. And you think about how it feels to delegate to your team members that will always show up with the result when they have it, or let you know that the expectation is changing because they've run into some mistake along the way, but you can trust that they'll at least let you know along the way what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third one, then let's go to the group a bit. The third one is solutions over reason. So this is just you're just like resourceful, you find a way, you're just incredibly creative. I've had team members like this, like a problem comes up, they just create their way around it. They find a solution. And so you're just obsessing about solutions over reasons why you haven't done something. You don't really care for any reasons or excuses. You're just like, you're going to find a solution, right? You're absolutely determined. And so I think accountability is kind of made up of these three things. You're thinking ahead, you're obsessing about maintaining your expectations, and you're finding a way no matter what, and taking responsibility for these things. And that's kind of the overall theme. People mention psych safety. And we had a wonderful session with Amy Edmondson a month or so ago, where we talked about the connections between accountability and psych safety. And if you haven't heard that session, it's a podcast now. You can listen to that or watch that. It was a really wonderful session, I thought. And there you go. My team's just put it in the chat. You can watch it there. And if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe to our podcast. So most of these sessions go into the podcast. We've had about 1 million downloads now of different sessions, which is really cool. Anyway, so delegation, coming back to delegation, we think that there are, the first thing is, what can I only do? The second thing is then let go, delegate well, let go. But you've got to do that with clarity and autonomy. So lots of clarity and lots of autonomy, but then do it in a way with accountability as well. So you're really kind of making sure that people will really do things. So those are kind of the cliff notes there. Let's maybe ask the question, Emma. Actually, before that, anyone have any questions? I haven't been watching the Q&A. Any questions coming up for people?
Amazing comments, though. The transcript for the comments is going to be incredible to look back to. But I guess one of the things we did, if you have any questions about, one thing that's coming up for me is just the idea that we're talking about the linkage between delegation and accountability, but also psychological safety is also intermixed. They're also intertwined, that you really have to think about all three of them. Trying to delegate well means that you need to also think about accountability. And with that, you also are necessarily creating psychological safety. And anyways, that's just something coming up for me. But one thing that we did want to ask you to think about, and thinking about this from the very beginning, as we were talking about building in really difficult leadership skills, is what else is coming up for you that you face as a leader or people manager that's incredibly difficult to get right? What's been the biggest challenge, in addition to things like delegation, which is difficult? What other things we'll, dive into them, talk about them in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, Cliff Note is what other topics would you like us to dig into as it relates to leadership and management skills? Because we're starting to do more of these sessions on specific skills. I think it's really interesting. So thanks, Kitty, for being first. How to manage up. It's a really interesting challenge. Let's get comments from lots of people. Thanks, Arturo. And
AI and
there's
delegation.
AI. Yeah, and you can do some plus ones if you like. But
Mhm.
what are some of the topics that you're interested in kind of really digging into more in some of these sessions? Let's ask that for a minute.
Yeah.
As you're thinking about that, give you sort of 10 seconds. Just wanted to, before we wrap up, we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. Before we wrap up, just want to let folks know, if you've been following us for a while, you've been hearing us talking about this for a couple of months now, but we've launched a really big breakthrough. It's our biggest breakthrough in 24 years in leadership, and we think it's a really big disruption in the whole leadership space. And it's a 6-month digital experience to make people better leaders that we think we'll have data really soon to show is more effective than in-person offsites, more effective than coaching, more effective than any other way of really doing learning. So we're super excited about this, and it can scale. And it's called Lead. And we have an open enrollment version of this that started. We've got another one in April. So if you're interested in that, my team will put a link in, or you'll get there from the homepage, neuroleadership.com. But there's an open enrollment version now, and it's a breakthrough idea. It's a 6-month, 15 minutes a week for 6 months. And if you're from a company interested in chatting about that and want to talk to someone, just put Lead and your company name in the chat, and someone will follow up with you in the next while. So put Lead and your company name if you're interested in learning about that. And so Lead is a solution for all levels of people manager, that giving them the core ideas necessary to be more effective as managers, from a first-time manager, middle manager, senior manager, all of them having the same common language. Fantastic. And then the other thing, as part of that, we've actually built an AI. We've built an AI bot called Niles, and Niles stands for Neuro Intelligent Leadership Enhancer. And we've been training Niles. It's amazing. We put all our content and models and tools, everything into Niles, and they've been training him or her or it or they, whatever it is. And you can basically ask Niles any question about managing and leading, like, how do I deal with this person? How do I reduce conflict? How do I give feedback? But everything, but you can actually make it very contextual even, and it's going to get smarter and smarter. So it'll hold like everyone's scarf profiles, all sorts of things. But right now you can ask it these amazing questions, and it gives you these really useful answers really fast. So Niles stands for Neuro Intelligent Leadership Enhancer. And we've had a bunch of companies say actually would be interested just in like Niles, in exploring Niles. And if you're from an organization interested in just a conversation about that, we'd love to chat to some folks and just see, you kind of show it to you and just kind of discuss how it might look. It's really early stages for us. We're not ready to like deploy this month, but just put Niles and your company name in the chat if that's of interest, and we'd love to chat with you about kind of how that might look. So essentially having an AI bot available, having an AI bot available for every people manager and even every employee to be able to ask questions. So put your company name and the word Niles if you're interested just in that. It's a part of Lead. So Lead is the 6-month experience and Niles is inside that. But we've had some companies just interested in kind of, hey, we'd love to have a bot that literally pick up your phone and say, hey, Niles, I've got to give this person some feedback. We had a big conflict last week. How do I do it? And it'll actually give you a really good answer. So Niles, just put your company name, Niles, in the chat if you're interested. Someone will have a chat with you. As I said, it's very exploratory. We'd love feedback from you about how you picture it, and we'll show it to you. It's really, really cool. Otherwise, put Lead in the chat. Very good. I think that's everything we wanted to cover today. Just super interesting conversation. I loved all the interaction. Emma, any closing comments for you?
No, I think this is great. And I love the suggestions for future topics. I think we'll dive into them. And also, like any interest in Niles, we're super excited about Niles and Lead. So
yeah, really, really fascinating. What's coming up next week? I know we've got some fun things. I think next week we have Women's History Month. We've got a session on our gender bias work. We've got a session after that coming up on, I think we're launching the habit activation platform as a concept. It's a really big new concept. We've got some cool things coming up. So Emma, thanks so much for being here. Thanks to the team behind the scenes. We're going to hand back to Shelby for some announcements. And thanks so much, everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma and David, for today's discussion. I just have a few housekeeping notes, so stay with me, some announcements to share. So first of all, we are going to be doing a summit survey because we are excited. We're getting planning underway, and we really want to hear from you on what you want us to focus for 2024. So my team is going to drop the link in the chat. Please participate in that. We want to hear as much feedback as possible. We'll also be sharing it in our follow-up. As David mentioned, our next cohort of LEAD will be launching April 18th. So if you're interested in joining in that group, our team will share information as well. We've had wonderful progress so far, and we're really excited to see how this continues to evolve. Insider Exchange, this is specifically for senior executives. If you enjoy this show, we really think you'll love that experience. It gives you the opportunity to have roundtable discussions with our internal leaders and help us craft new innovations. So if you are interested in applying, we'll also share that link. And we want to partner with our community more. So if you are looking to host with NLI and you want to be a co-partner in hosting an event, please check out the information that we'll share and stay connected with us. Reach out to our teams. We'd love to hear more from you. And if you enjoyed this episode, as David also mentioned, we have our podcast. So listen to Your Brain at Work wherever you listen to your podcast. And that is where we say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here as always, and have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next week.